December 1941. Alexandria Harbor, Egypt. The water was warm and dark and tasted of diesel fuel and salt, where Lieutenant Luigi Duran de la Pen swam beneath the surface with a rebreather apparatus that recycled his breath and prevented telltale bubbles from betraying his position to British sentries patrolling above, where he guided a human torpedo called Mayale, the pig, that carried 300 kilograms of explosive toward the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth, whose massive hull loomed in the darkness like a steel cliff, where British sailors slept confident in their security, while an Italian naval officer they would have dismissed as operating obsolete equipment from a second-rate navy approached with weapons that Royal Navy intelligence had categorized as ineffective curiosities, as desperate improvisations by a nation whose naval engineering was widely understood to be inferior to British standards, as cardboard boats and floating coffins that posed no serious threat to the Mediterranean fleet that dominated the theater through overwhelming superiority in battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. De la Pen was 31 years old, a career naval officer who had trained for 2 years in the specialized tactics of underwater assault operations, who commanded the 10th Light Flotilla's assault swimmers, who had volunteered for missions that British naval officers would have considered suicide because the equipment seemed too fragile and the tactics seemed too desperate, and the probability of survival seemed too low to justify the risk. But the Regia Marina, the Royal Italian Navy, was outnumbered and outgunned by British forces that had established near absolute control over the Mediterranean after the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, where Italian battleships had been humiliated in night engagement, where British radar and gunnery superiority had destroyed Italian heavy units before they could effectively engage, where the tactical disaster had confirmed British assumptions that Italian naval capabilities were inferior and that the Mediterranean would remain British-controlled despite Italian numerical strength in lighter units. The asymmetry was brutal and obvious. Britain possessed aircraft carriers that could project power across the theater, possessed modern battleships with fire control systems that allowed accurate gunnery at ranges where Italian vessels couldn't respond effectively, possessed cruisers and destroyers in sufficient numbers to maintain blockades and convoy escorts that strangled Italian supply lines while protecting British logistics. Italy possessed more submarines than Britain, possessed fast light cruisers, possessed numerous destroyers and torpedo boats, but lacked the capital ships and carriers that defined naval power in 1941, lacked the radar technology that made night combat feasible, lacked the tactical doctrine that allowed coordinated operations between surface units and air power. This asymmetry created conditions where conventional naval operations were suicidal for Italian forces, where attempting to contest British control through fleet actions would simply result in Italian ships being destroyed by British firepower they couldn't match, where the only viable strategy was asymmetric warfare using weapons and tactics that exploited British vulnerabilities rather than confronting British strengths directly. The Decima MAS, 10th Motor Torpedo Boat Flotilla, represented this asymmetric approach, specialized in unconventional operations using small craft that couldn't survive conventional combat, but which could penetrate defended harbors where larger ships couldn't operate, using human torpedoes that were more submersible than submarine and more torpedo than boat, using tactics that British naval tradition considered ungentlemanly and desperate, but which offered the only realistic method for Italian forces to inflict damage on British capital ships that were otherwise invulnerable. The equipment itself was the source of British mockery, The MS boats were small motor torpedo boats built from wood and light metal, 45 feet long, displacing 15 tons, powered by gasoline engines that were notoriously unreliable, armed with 2 torpedoes or depth charges and machine guns that were adequate for engaging merchant vessels, but useless against warships. Vessels so lightly constructed that 50 caliber machine gun fire could penetrate their hulls. Vessels whose gasoline engines created fire hazard that made them floating bombs if hit by any weapon larger than rifle caliber. Vessels that British sailors called cardboard boats because they seemed too fragile to be serious military equipment, seemed like toys that would disintegrate in any actual combat engagement. The human torpedoes, SLC for Siluro, a lenta corsa, slow-running torpedo, were even more improbable. Cylindrical vehicles 22 feet long carrying 2-man crews who sat astride the torpedo, wearing diving suits and breathing apparatus, who guided the weapon underwater at 3 knots maximum speed toward targets in defended harbors, who would detach the 300-kilogram warhead and place it beneath the target ship's hull using magnetic clamps, who would then attempt to escape before the timed fuse detonated the charge hours later when the crew was hopefully far enough away to survive the explosion. The concept was borderline suicidal, required volunteers willing to penetrate enemy-controlled waters while riding exposed on a torpedo that could be detected by patrol boats, could be caught by anti-submarine nets, could fail mechanically, leaving the crew swimming in hostile waters where capture or death were the only outcomes. British intelligence had first learned about the SLC program in 1940 through agents in Italy who reported that the Regia Marina was training assault swimmers and developing human-guided torpedoes, intelligence that British naval planners had assessed as indicating Italian desperation rather than effective innovation. Assessed as confirming that Italian naval strategy had degenerated to suicide tactics because conventional operations had proven impossible against British superiority. The assessment included dismissive language. Italian development of human torpedoes and assault swimmer tactics indicates recognition that conventional naval operations are untenable. These unconventional methods represent desperation rather than innovation. Equipment reliability is questionable given Italian industrial limitations. Training requirements are extensive and likely exceeding Italian institutional capabilities. Overall threat level is assessed as low. These systems may achieve occasional successes through luck, but cannot constitute systematic threat to British naval forces. This assessment was filed with Mediterranean Fleet Headquarters, where it joined numerous other intelligence reports about Italian capabilities, was noted as interesting curiosity, but not prioritized for defensive countermeasures, because British commanders believed that harbor defenses consisting of anti-submarine nets, patrol boats, and alert sentries would be adequate to defeat any Italian attack attempts, believed that Italian technological inferiority and tactical desperation meant that their unconventional weapons were unlikely to pose serious threats to capital ships moored in defended harbors like Alexandria, where multiple layers of security protected the Mediterranean fleet's heaviest units. The first Italian human torpedo attack had occurred in September 1940 against Gibraltar, had failed when equipment malfunctions forced the assault team to abandon the mission, had resulted in crew capture by British forces who interrogated them and examined their equipment and confirmed the assessment that the SLC was crude improvisation that posed minimal threat because it was too unreliable and too difficult to operate effectively. British technical analysis of the captured SLC noted, "The Italian human torpedo represents interesting concept, but practical limitations make it ineffective for operational use. The breathing apparatus is complex and prone to failure. The guidance system is rudimentary. The weapon's slow speed makes it vulnerable to detection. The requirement that crew members attach warheads manually creates operational bottleneck that prevents efficient employment. Assessment. This weapon is unlikely to achieve significant results against defended targets. Subsequent Italian attacks in 1941 had achieved limited successes, had damaged British cruisers at Suda Bay in March, had demonstrated that the SLC could penetrate harbor defenses under specific conditions. But these successes were dismissed by British commanders as fortunate accidents rather than indicators that Italian unconventional warfare capabilities were effective, were explained away as failures of local security rather than successes of Italian tactics, were used to justify improving harbor defense procedures rather than fundamentally reassessing the threat that human torpedoes posed to capital ships in defended anchorages. The December 18, 1941 attack on Alexandria represented the culmination of 2 years of Italian development and training, represented the operation where Italian asymmetric warfare would prove whether desperation tactics could actually defeat British conventional superiority, represented the test of whether equipment that British intelligence dismissed as cardboard boats and floating coffins could actually sink battleships that represented the foundation of British Mediterranean naval power. The assault force consisted of 3 SLC human torpedoes carried to the release point by the submarine Siré, released 9 miles from Alexandria Harbor at 1842 hours on December 18th, the 6 crew members riding their torpedoes through the darkness toward the harbor entrance, where anti-submarine nets and patrol boats protected the inner basin, where HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, the Mediterranean fleet's only operational battleships, lay at anchor along with tankers and support vessels that sustained the fleet's operations. De La Penne's target was Queen Elizabeth, the flagship, the symbol of British naval power in the theater, the vessel whose destruction would represent tactical and psychological victory that would demonstrate Italian capabilities and shake British confidence. His approach began at 2,000 hours, navigating by compass and dead reckoning through waters he had studied through aerial reconnaissance photographs and agent reports, avoiding patrol boats whose searchlights swept the harbor entrance, approaching the anti-submarine nets that were the first defensive barrier. The nets were supposed to be impenetrable, steel mesh barriers suspended from floats that extended from surface to seabed, that prevented submarines from entering the harbor, that created physical obstacles that human torpedoes would have to penetrate or circumvent. But Italian intelligence had identified that the nets required openings to allow friendly vessels to enter and exit, that these openings were guarded but could be penetrated during periods when traffic was scheduled, that timing the assault to coincide with British vessel movements would allow the SLC crews to slip through the openings while guards were distracted by the legitimate traffic they were supposed to facilitate. At 20:37 hours, a British destroyer entered Alexandria Harbor, returning from patrol. The anti-submarine nets opened to allow passage. De La Penne guided his SLC through the opening, while British sentries watched the destroyer and failed to notice the small disturbance in the water 20 meters behind the warship, failed to detect the human torpedo that had just penetrated the primary defensive barrier through patient timing and exploitation of operational procedures that created vulnerabilities in systems designed to be impenetrable. Inside the harbor, the challenge became navigation and avoiding detection by patrol boats that circled the anchored capital ships, became maintaining depth control on the SLC, which was neutrally buoyant and sensitive to trim changes that could surface the torpedo unexpectedly and expose the crew to sentries who would immediately open fire, became conserving the battery power and breathing gas that limited operational endurance to perhaps 3 hours total from release to attack to escape. De La Penne located Queen Elizabeth at 2143 hours, the battleship's hull visible as darker shadow against the night sky, the underwater portion of the hull extending downward into darkness that provided concealment but also disorientation, because navigating beneath a stationary ship in zero visibility required maintaining spatial awareness while operating equipment that was temperamental and physically exhausting to control. He positioned the SLC beneath the battleship's keel at 2158 hours, detached the 300-kilogram warhead from the torpedo body, maneuvered the warhead into position beneath the ship's magazines where explosion would be most devastating, attached the magnetic clamps that held the warhead to the hull, set the timer for 6 hours delay, completed the attachment at 22 to 13 hours, having successfully placed the charge exactly where Italian planning had intended. The escape was supposed to be straightforward: surface at safe distance from Queen Elizabeth, swim to shore, evade British patrols, reach safe house where Italian intelligence network would hide the crew until they could be exfiltrated. But De La Penne's rebreather failed at 22 to 20 hours, carbon dioxide buildup causing disorientation and nausea that made swimming impossible, forcing him to surface prematurely near Queen Elizabeth, where British sentries immediately spotted him and raised alarm, where patrol boats converged and captured him and his crewmen before they could reach the harbor entrance. The British interrogation began immediately, the base commander understanding that Italians wouldn't risk penetrating Alexandria defenses without hostile intent, understanding that the captured swimmers had probably placed explosives somewhere, though they refused to say where or when the charges would detonate, understanding that the battleships were probably the targets, but not knowing which ships were threatened, or how to locate charges that could be anywhere along hundreds of meters of hull that would require hours to search thoroughly. De La Penne was brought to Queen Elizabeth's brig at 2340 hours, confined in a holding cell while the ship's security officers attempted to extract information about the attack, attempted to convince him that cooperating would save his life, while resistance would result in his execution as saboteur. He refused to provide any information beyond confirming that an attack was underway, refused to specify targets or timing, refused to cooperate even when threatened with being left aboard the ship, when the charges detonated, and when he would die along with the British crew members who were simply doing their duty. At 03:15 hours on December 19th, 5 minutes before the timer would activate the charge, De La Penne requested to speak with Queen Elizabeth's captain, told him that a large explosive charge was attached to the ship's hull beneath the forward magazines, told him that the charge would detonate in approximately 5 minutes, told him that the crew should abandon ship immediately because the explosion would be catastrophic and would probably sink the battleship. The captain, Captain Charles Morgan, immediately sounded general quarters and ordered crew to abandon ship, evacuating 700 sailors in 3 minutes, while also attempting to locate and defuse the charge that De La Penne had described. The charge detonated at 0319 hours, with force that lifted Queen Elizabeth's 33,000-ton hull visibly from the water, that buckled armor plates, that ruptured fuel tanks and flooded compartments, that killed 8 sailors who hadn't evacuated quickly enough, and injured dozens more from the blast and from falling equipment and from structural failures that occurred when the explosion's shockwave propagated through the ship's framework. The battleship settled by the bow, taking on thousands of tons of water through holes torn in the hull plating, settling onto the harbor bottom with only upper decks remaining above water, effectively sunk though technically grounded rather than destroyed because the shallow harbor prevented complete submersion. HMS Valiant was attacked simultaneously by the second SLC team, was damaged by explosion that occurred at 03:20 hours, settled onto the harbor bottom alongside Queen Elizabeth, both battleships disabled by weapons that British intelligence had dismissed as ineffective curiosities, by tactics that British tradition considered ungentlemanly, by Italian unconventional warfare that had achieved what Italian conventional naval operations could never accomplish. The shock in British naval circles was profound and immediate. Shock that Italian forces had penetrated Alexandria's defenses, which were supposed to be impregnable. Shock that human torpedoes had successfully attacked capital ships, despite British assessments that the weapons were too unreliable to pose systematic threat. Shock that both Mediterranean fleet battleships were simultaneously disabled by 6 Italian sailors riding equipment that British technical analysis had concluded was crude improvisation unlikely to achieve significant results. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean fleet, reported to London, "Both Queen Elizabeth and Valiant have been severely damaged by Italian underwater assault and are resting on harbor bottom. Casualties are moderate, but ships will require months of repair before returning to service. The Italian human torpedo system has proven far more effective than our previous assessments indicated. Our harbor defense procedures were inadequate. The Italians have achieved by unconventional means what they could not achieve through conventional naval operations. This represents serious blow to Mediterranean fleet capability and to British naval prestige. Immediate reassessment of Italian unconventional warfare capabilities is required." The Admiralty's response reflected genuine shock that Italians, whose navy had been consistently defeated in conventional engagements, whose equipment had been assessed as inferior, whose tactics had been dismissed as desperation, had managed to disable both British battleships in the Mediterranean theater through attack that had cost Italy 6 sailors captured, but had achieved strategic effect disproportionate to the resources committed. The shock was compounded by recognition that British intelligence assessments had been wrong, that dismissing Italian capabilities as inferior had created vulnerabilities that Italian asymmetric warfare had exploited, that mockery of cardboard boats and floating coffins had been arrogant misunderstanding of what unconventional warfare could accomplish when conventional approaches were untenable. British technical analysis of the attack, conducted by salvage engineers examining the damage to Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, revealed that the SLC was actually sophisticated equipment despite its appearance, revealed that the breathing apparatus worked reliably when properly maintained, revealed that the guidance systems were adequate for their purpose, revealed that Italian engineers had solved technical problems that British assessment had assumed were unsolvable given Italian industrial limitations. The analysis concluded, "The Italian SLC human torpedo represents effective weapon system that we underestimated. The equipment is reliable when operated by trained crews. The tactics are effective against defended harbors. Our previous assessment that Italian unconventional weapons posed minimal threat was incorrect. These weapons can achieve decisive results when employed by competent operators against vulnerable targets. Recommend immediate implementation of improved harbor defenses specifically designed to counter human torpedo threats." The strategic impact extended beyond the tactical loss of 2 battleships, extended to psychological effect on British confidence and on Italian morale, extended to operational consequences as the Mediterranean fleet lacked capital ships to contest Italian surface operations for 6 months until repairs were completed and replacement battleships arrived from the Atlantic Fleet. The Italian propaganda celebrating the Alexandria attack emphasized that 6 brave sailors had achieved what the entire Italian battle fleet couldn't accomplish, emphasized that British superiority in conventional naval power meant nothing when Italian ingenuity and courage attacked British vulnerabilities, emphasized that asymmetric warfare could equalize disparities in resources and technology. The operational consequences were immediate and severe for British Mediterranean strategy. Without battleships to anchor the fleet, British naval operations had to rely on cruisers and destroyers, which couldn't contest Italian capital ships if they sortied, couldn't provide the heavy gunfire support that battleships offered for amphibious operations or convoy protection, couldn't project the deterrent presence that battleships provided simply by existing as potential threat. For 6 months between December 1941 and June 1942, the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean shifted toward Italy, despite Italy's overall strategic disadvantages, shifted because 2 battleships sitting on harbor bottom represented capability removed from the strategic equation, regardless of whether they were technically salvageable or permanently lost. The British salvage operation to raise Queen Elizabeth and Valiant consumed enormous resources, required specialized equipment and hundreds of workers, took 4 months before the ships could be refloated, and another 2 months before temporary repairs allowed them to steam to shipyards for complete restoration. The salvage work was conducted under constant threat of Italian air attack, required elaborate defensive measures to protect the vulnerable ships that couldn't maneuver or defend themselves, cost approximately £3 million, and diverted resources from other operations that might have had more immediate military value than recovering disabled battleships that wouldn't return to service for months. During this period, Italian naval forces achieved temporary operational freedom that allowed convoy operations to Libya that sustained Axis forces in North Africa, allowed surface raids on British convoys that inflicted losses British escorts couldn't prevent without battleship support, allowed Regia Marina to demonstrate that when freed from overwhelming British superiority, Italian forces were competent and aggressive, and capable of achieving tactical successes that contradicted British assumptions about Italian naval inferiority. The propaganda value for Italy was immense. The Alexandria attack became symbol of Italian martial spirit, demonstrated that Italian forces could defeat British forces despite overall disadvantages, provided morale boost at time when Italian military was suffering defeats in North Africa and Greece, showed that asymmetric warfare offered path to victory when conventional approaches had failed. Mussolini declared the attack a great victory, promoted the participants, commissioned films and articles celebrating Italian naval heroism, used the success to argue that Italy remained formidable power despite strategic reverses in other theaters. But the British mockery of Italian equipment and tactics had international dimensions beyond Mediterranean theater operations, had shaped American assessments of Italian military capabilities, had influenced Allied planning that dismissed Italian forces as ineffective secondary enemy, whose defeat would be straightforward once resources were available. The Alexandria attack forced reassessment, forced recognition that underestimating enemies because their equipment appeared crude or their tactics appeared desperate was a dangerous mistake that created surprise when reality contradicted comfortable assumptions. The Decima MAS operations didn't end with Alexandria, but continued throughout 1942 and 1943, continued to target British shipping with human torpedoes and explosive motorboats, and assault swimmers, continued to achieve results that contradicted British assessments that Italian unconventional warfare was desperate improvisation rather than systematic capability. In June 1942, Italian explosive motorboats attacked British convoy in Mediterranean. Small boats loaded with explosives driven by pilots who would jump overboard at last moment before boats crashed into targets. Boats that British sailors called suicide boats, though pilots usually survived by abandoning the boats before impact. Boats that sank multiple merchant vessels and demonstrated again that Italian asymmetric tactics could inflict damage that conventional Italian naval forces couldn't achieve. In July 1942, Italian assault swimmers attacked Gibraltar again, this time successfully placing limpet mines on multiple merchant vessels in the harbor, demonstrating that the September 1940 failure had been learning experience rather than proof that the tactics were impossible, demonstrating that Italian unconventional warfare capabilities had improved through training and equipment refinement, demonstrating that British harbor defenses remained vulnerable despite improvements implemented after Alexandria. The cumulative effect of these operations was to force British commanders to allocate significant resources to harbor defense that might otherwise have been deployed offensively, to create constant anxiety about Italian asymmetric attacks that made British naval bases feel less secure than they should have been given overall Allied superiority. to demonstrate that unconventional warfare could impose costs disproportionate to resources committed, because defending against asymmetric threats required more effort than executing asymmetric attacks. British countermeasures evolved throughout 1942 as Royal Navy learned from painful experience what worked against human torpedoes and what didn't work. Anti-submarine nets were reinforced and extended deeper to prevent penetration along harbor bottoms, where human torpedoes operated. Patrol boats with specialized detection equipment were deployed to search for swimmers and small craft. Underwater lighting was installed in critical areas to reduce concealment. Noisemakers and depth charges were dropped randomly in harbor approaches to discourage Italian teams from attempting attacks. Guard forces were increased and trained specifically to watch for human torpedo indicators, like unusual water disturbances or sounds of underwater equipment. These countermeasures were effective but expensive, required constant vigilance and resources that could have been deployed elsewhere, represented British response to Italian threat that had initially been dismissed as minimal, but which experience had proven was serious and systematic. The evolution from mockery to respect was gradual and reluctant, driven by operational necessity rather than intellectual reassessment, driven by losses that forced recognition that Italian unconventional warfare was effective, regardless of whether British prejudices acknowledged Italian competence. The American Office of Naval Intelligence received reports of the Alexandria attack through British channels, incorporated the intelligence into their assessments of Italian naval capabilities, revised previous evaluations that had largely echoed British dismissal of Italian unconventional warfare as ineffective desperation. The revised American assessment noted, Italian human torpedo attacks on British capital ships at Alexandria demonstrate that unconventional weapons can achieve strategic results against defended targets. Previous assessments underestimated Italian capabilities in this area. While Italian conventional naval power remains inferior to British standards, their unconventional warfare capabilities represent serious threat that requires defensive countermeasures. Recommend U.S. Navy develop improved harbor defense procedures to counter human torpedo threats before American forces encounter similar attacks. This American reassessment, prompted by British experience at Alexandria, led to U.S. Navy developing harbor defense improvements that were implemented at Pearl Harbor, at San Diego, at other major bases where capital ships concentrated in defended anchorages. The irony was that Italian success against British arrogance educated American forces who learned from British mistakes and implemented defenses that prevented similar attacks on American ships. That the British dismissal of cardboard boats as ineffective had been corrected through painful experience that American forces absorbed vicariously without suffering equivalent disasters. De La Penne and his crewmen were held as prisoners of war by British forces, were eventually repatriated to Italy in prisoner exchange, returned to heroes' welcome as the sailors who had sunk HMS Queen Elizabeth received Italy's highest military decoration, became symbols of Italian naval competence that had achieved victory through courage and innovation despite overall strategic disadvantages. De La Penne's post-war career included service in Italian Navy during NATO era, included interactions with British naval officers who had participated in salvaging and repairing the ships he had attacked, included conversations where former enemies could discuss the Alexandria operation with professional respect that replaced the wartime mockery and shock. In a 1967 reunion with British veterans who had served on Queen Elizabeth during the attack, De La Penne discussed the operation and the British reaction to Italian unconventional warfare. He recalled, "Your intelligence dismissed our equipment as cardboard boats and floating coffins. Your officers believed Italian engineering was inferior, and our tactics were desperate suicide missions. This arrogance created the vulnerability we exploited. You assumed that because our equipment appeared crude and our tactics appeared unconventional, We couldn't pose serious threat to your capital ships. The assumption was wrong. Our equipment worked. Our training was adequate. Our courage was sufficient. The cardboard boats that you mocked sank your flagship. The British officers present at this reunion acknowledged that pre-war and wartime assessments of Italian capabilities had been influenced by cultural assumptions about Italian inferiority, acknowledged that mockery of Italian equipment had prevented realistic evaluation of threats, acknowledged that the Alexandria attack had been a wake-up call that forced Royal Navy to take unconventional warfare seriously rather than dismissing it as desperation from inferior enemy. One British veteran, Commander James Stewart, who had been Queen Elizabeth's damage control officer during the attack, responded, "You were correct that we underestimated Italian capabilities. We assumed technical superiority meant invulnerability. We didn't imagine that 6 sailors on human torpedoes could disable 2 battleships in defended harbor. The attack taught us that asymmetric warfare could overcome conventional superiority, that mockery was poor substitute for defensive preparedness, that underestimating enemies creates vulnerabilities that competent enemies exploit. Your cardboard boats weren't cardboard. Your desperate tactics weren't desperate. Your inferior equipment wasn't inferior. We were wrong, and we paid for being wrong." This frank admission represented evolution from wartime certainty to post-war humility, represented recognition that Italian unconventional warfare had succeeded not because British defenses were weak, but because British assumptions about Italian capabilities were wrong, represented acceptance that cultural arrogance had contributed to tactical defeat that might have been prevented if Italian capabilities had been assessed realistically rather than through lens of prejudice about Italian inferiority. The legacy of the Alexandria attack influenced post-war naval doctrine across multiple nations, influenced development of harbor defense systems designed specifically to counter human torpedoes and swimmer attacks, influenced special operations forces that replicated Italian Decima MAS tactics and applied them in conflicts where asymmetric warfare offered advantages that conventional operations couldn't achieve. The U.S. Navy SEALs, the British Special Boat Service, Soviet Naval Spetsnaz, all traced conceptual lineage to Italian assault swimmers who had proven that small teams with specialized equipment could achieve strategic results by attacking enemy vulnerabilities rather than confronting enemy strengths. The human torpedo itself evolved into more sophisticated swimmer delivery vehicles used by special operations forces, evolved into unmanned underwater vehicles guided remotely or autonomously, evolved into technology that bore little resemblance to the crude mayal that De La Pen had ridden into Alexandria Harbor, but which embodied the same tactical principle that attacking defended targets from beneath the waterline could achieve results that surface or aerial attacks couldn't accomplish. But beyond the tactical and technical evolution, the Alexandria attack's fundamental lesson was about the danger of underestimating enemies based on assumptions about their capabilities, about the vulnerability created when cultural arrogance prevents realistic threat assessment, about the shock that results when comfortable certainties encounter reality that contradicts them. The British had laughed at Italian cardboard boats, had mocked floating coffins, had dismissed human torpedoes as ineffective curiosities from desperate inferior enemy, had paid for this dismissal with 2 battleships disabled in supposedly impregnable harbor by 6 sailors riding equipment that British intelligence had concluded couldn't pose serious threat. The shock wasn't that Italian equipment worked. Post-attack analysis showed it was competently engineered and reliable when properly operated. The shock was that British assessment had been so wrong, that assumptions about Italian inferiority had been so pervasive that they prevented realistic evaluation, that mockery had substituted for analysis until reality forced recognition that the mocked enemy was more capable than comfortable assumptions had allowed. This pattern, underestimating enemies because their methods seem crude, dismissing unconventional tactics as desperation, assuming that inferior resources mean inferior results, repeated throughout military history before and after Alexandria, repeated in conflicts where technologically superior forces were surprised by enemies who attacked vulnerabilities rather than confronting strengths, repeated wherever cultural or technological arrogance created blind spots that competent enemies exploited. The Italians who attacked Alexandria weren't desperate. They were pragmatic. They couldn't defeat British fleet in conventional battle, so they attacked British fleet unconventionally where it was vulnerable. They couldn't match British naval technology, so they developed alternative technology optimized for different mission. They couldn't compete in surface warfare, so they competed underwater where British advantages were neutralized. This was strategic adaptation rather than desperate improvisation, was competent engineering rather than crude desperation, was effective military operation rather than lucky accident. The British who defended Alexandria weren't incompetent. They were arrogant. They assumed Italian inferiority rather than assessing Italian capabilities. They dismissed unconventional threats rather than preparing for them. They mocked equipment rather than analyzing what it could accomplish. They learned from the experience. Harbor defenses improved, intelligence assessments became more realistic, respect for Italian unconventional warfare replaced dismissive mockery. But the learning came after 2 battleships were disabled and after strategic advantage shifted temporarily toward Italy in Mediterranean theater. The cardboard boats weren't cardboard. The floating coffins weren't coffins for Italian crews, but for British battleships. The equipment that British intelligence dismissed as ineffective achieved exactly what Italian planning intended. The tactics that British tradition considered ungentlemanly proved effective regardless of whether they aligned with British concepts of proper naval warfare. The asymmetric approach that British commanders thought represented desperation actually represented rational response to strategic disadvantage. That was the lesson of Alexandria. The lesson that British shock at Italian success reflected British failure to understand what Italian capabilities actually were. The lesson that mockery based on assumptions was poor foundation for defensive planning. The lesson that underestimated enemies achieve surprise when they prove more capable than comfortable prejudices assumed they could be. The lesson that laughing at cardboard boats was mistake that stopped being funny when those boats sank battleships that were supposed to be invulnerable in defended harbors, protected by defenses that were supposed to be adequate against threats that British intelligence had assessed as minimal. The shock was deserved because the defeat was preventable, was result of choices to dismiss warnings and mock capabilities rather than preparing for threats that intelligence indicated existed, but which institutional assumptions declared were impossible or irrelevant. 6 Italian sailors achieved strategic victory riding equipment that British assessment had concluded was too crude to work, using tactics that British doctrine considered desperate rather than effective, proving that sometimes the mocked inferior enemy knows something the arrogant superior force hasn't learned yet. That wars are won by achieving objectives, not by having better equipment, and that objectives can sometimes be achieved by attacking vulnerabilities rather than confronting strengths, even when the attack comes from cardboard boats that everyone laughed at until they sank battleships, and no one was laughing anymore.